Valoria discarded one gray egg that would someday defeat a legendary tier beast. The boy carrying it had just been told he possessed no future. Neither knew the egg belonged to a species history had nearly erased. That impossible victory began with one mistake. Nobody in Valoria bothered to question. Like and subscribe for more beast evolution stories. Now let's rewind. Back at the soulbond ceremony, Ethan Vale's future seemed to vanish. In Valoria, every 16-year-old eventually stood before the soulbond altar. The ritual matched each soul with a beast egg meant for them. Common tier beasts promised modest futures, while rare tier beasts opened far greater doors. Your beast tier decided schooling, status, money, and how strangers measured your potential. Ethan Vale entered that system with nothing impressive attached to his name. His father worked as a blacksmith, respected locally, but powerful nowhere else. He only wanted one fair shot at becoming a real beast tamer. Each successful ritual made Ethan's approaching turn feel heavier inside his chest. Eventually, the supervising official called his name across the crowded ceremony hall. Ethan stepped forward, while every familiar rule promised an immediate result. He placed one hand against the ancient surface and waited for light. Nothing happened, so he held still and waited several seconds longer. The altar remained dark, refusing even the weakest sign of compatibility. No egg appeared beside him, and no tear formed above the platform. Whispers began spreading before Ethan finally removed his trembling hand. Most people understood a disappointing common beast, but this looked far worse. The ritual had apparently found no beast willing to answer Ethan's soul. Someone laughed. Then another voice joined until embarrassment filled the hall. Ethan stared forward, because looking toward the crowd would only deepen it. The official showed irritation instead of curiosity about the impossible result. He reached toward a container reserved for defective and unwanted beast eggs. One dull gray egg sat inside, among things scheduled for disposal. The official lifted that egg and tossed it casually toward Ethan. The laughter grew louder because even the consolation prize looked embarrassing. Ethan caught the gray egg before it struck the floor between them. For a moment, anger tempted him to leave it behind deliberately. Then he noticed how easily everyone treated another living possibility as garbage. That feeling struck too close to what had just happened to him. Ethan tucked the unwanted egg carefully beneath one arm and walked away. By the time he reached home, the ceremony's laughter still echoed in his mind. At home, he examined the gray shell, expecting nothing except another disappointment. The egg remained quiet until a thin fracture finally crossed its surface. Ethan leaned closer as several pieces shifted and fell onto the table. A tiny ash-colored lizard pushed free and blinked at Ethan silently. Its body looked fragile enough to fit comfortably against his forearm. Ethan waited for the standard beast information to appear after hatching. A status panel appeared, but nearly every category remained completely empty. No tier appeared where even common should normally have been displayed. No skill appeared, and no familiar species name solved the mystery. Only one line remained visible beneath the tiny creature's empty status panel. Unregistered species was all Valoria's registry could tell Ethan about it. Another person might have taken that emptiness as confirmation of uselessness. Ethan had already watched one institution make that exact assumption about him. He decided the creature deserved more than another instant verdict from ignorance. Because of its ash-gray body, Ethan gave the hatchling one simple name. From that day forward, the unwanted creature would be called Ash. Naming him changed nothing about Ethan's standing with official taming institutions. Ironcrest Academy checked Ash's status once and rejected Ethan on the spot. Behind the clerk, Academy notices celebrated students already training with elite beasts. One name appeared beside an epic tier Thunderwolf, Damian Cross. Ethan barely noticed it then, because Ash's rejection mattered for more. An unregistered creature without tier created uncertainty. Nobody there wanted responsibility for. Ethan argued that Ash was alive, responsive, and clearly bonded beside him. Without an accepted tier, Ethan could not enter Ironcrest Academy's training program. Ash padded after him without understanding what another closed door meant. The sight kept Ethan from sinking completely into humiliation and frustration. Whatever society thought, this creature had chosen to remain near him. So Ethan stopped waiting for permission and started figuring Ash out himself. He took whatever work kept both of them fed beyond settled roads. Most days involved collecting low-grade materials from the forests outside town. He learned which merchants bought bark, minerals, shells, and beast remains. Most importantly, he began watching Ash with the attention of a researcher. Ash soon revealed one habit impossible for Ethan to dismiss as normal. The tiny beast tried eating nearly anything small enough to swallow. He chewed mineral fragments that most young beasts would have spat out immediately. He gnawed strips of tough bark without becoming sick afterward. He even consumed remains left behind by weak insect-type beasts nearby. Ethan panicked the first time, expecting poisoning or internal injury afterward. Ash simply licked his mouth and searched for something else interesting. Ethan stopped calling the behavior random and started recording every example carefully. He wrote down what Ash consumed, how much, and what happened afterward. Still, the pattern suggested Ash's body processed materials in an unusual way. Ethan couldn't explain it yet, but now he had a mystery worth chasing. Maybe the empty status screen did not mean Ash lacked abilities. Maybe the system simply lacked enough information to describe what he was. Their gathering roots crossed territory where even common beasts could become dangerous. Ethan owned no advanced equipment and had received no formal combat instruction. Ash was still too small to overpower most hostile beasts head-on. So Ethan relied on distance, awareness, and retreat whenever trouble appeared. That approach worked until one aggressive common beast closed the gap. Suddenly, Ethan had little room to escape without exposing Ash to the attack. The small lizard stiffened, placing himself instinctively between danger and Ethan. Ethan tried pulling him back before the stronger beast could strike. Ash opened his mouth first, producing something neither had practiced intentionally. A burst of thick, ash-colored smoke spread directly across the attacker's face. The common beast recoiled as its vision disappeared inside the choking cloud. Ash couldn't win, but that smoke had completely flipped the situation. Ethan seized those seconds and escaped with Ash before visibility returned. They barely reached a broken ridge before the common beast roared behind them. The smoke had bought seconds, not safety. Ash tried to produce another cloud, but only a thin cough escaped. Whatever he had done once, he could not spam it. Ethan pulled him beneath a split stone shelf as claws scraped past outside. The beast circled long enough for Ethan to hear Ash's breathing turn ragged. Only after the footsteps faded did Ethan let himself move again. His hands shook as he opened the notebook. The first lesson was brutal. Ash's strange smoke had limits. Used once, it created an escape. Wasted carelessly, it could leave them defenseless. From then on, Ethan treated smoke as an emergency tool, not a free attack. They practiced timing, retreat, and communication around that single advantage. The drills were crude, but each successful escape made their partnership more natural. Ethan also noticed Ash often looked to him before eating unfamiliar materials. The behavior felt like a small question waiting for permission or reassurance. Ethan began choosing safer samples instead of letting Ash consume everything blindly. That decision marked the first real shift in how he raised him. Ash's strange appetite was not a trick Ethan could exploit without consequences. If nobody understood Ash, careless experiments could kill him before any answer appeared. So Ethan turned the notebook from curiosity into a survival record. He tracked only changes that affected Ash's health, behavior, or chances in danger. Minerals vanished without sickness. Bark did too. Beast remains caused no obvious harm. The pattern made no sense, but repetition made it impossible to dismiss. Weeks passed while Ethan and Ash survived on low-grade materials from the frontier. Merchants knew them as the broke boy and his strange ash-colored lizard. Ethan cared less about the joke than about keeping both of them fed. Ash cared about simpler things: food, warmth, and staying close to Ethan. At night, he slept within reach and woke whenever Ethan moved suddenly. Ethan learned those small reactions before he learned anything about Ash's species. Their bond grew through routine because survival punished anyone who stopped paying attention. Still, every notebook page ended with the same problem. Observation was not explanation. Why could Ash digest stone without damaging himself from the inside? Why had the smoke appeared only when danger trapped them together? Ethan could record the questions, but he had no way to test the answers safely. One rainy evening, that limit finally became impossible to ignore. He needed someone who knew forgotten beasts, not another academy ranking chart. The next morning, Ethan started asking frontier traders for names. Most shrugged. Extinct lineages did not help ordinary merchants make money. Then an old mineral broker stopped laughing when Ethan described Ash's diet. He mentioned Professor Alden Reed, a beast scholar expelled from Iron Crest years earlier. Alden lived outside town and still researched creatures the Academy considered useless. The broker warned Ethan that Alden disliked visitors and trusted institutions even less. That warning only made Ethan more certain he had found the right person. He followed the directions the next day with Ash tucked close against the rain. Professor Alden barely looked interested when Ethan first explained the failed ceremony. Then Ash lifted his head from Ethan's coat. Alden froze. The old man's boredom vanished so fast, Ethan stopped speaking mid-sentence. For the first time, someone saw Ash and reacted with concern instead of ridicule. Ethan handed over the notebook before Alden could ask for it. Alden read the entries about minerals, bark, beast remains, and defensive smoke. He questioned Ethan about appetite, recovery, body temperature, and every failed feeding attempt. The questions were precise enough to make Ethan nervous and hopeful together. Finally, Alden closed the notebook and gave the forgotten lineage a name. Ashborn. Modern Valoria treated Ashborn as extinct because almost no stable adults remained on record. Unlike ordinary beasts, Ashborn did not follow one fixed evolutionary branch. They could devour foreign material and adapt useful biological characteristics from it. Every impossible meal in Ethan's notebook suddenly gained a terrifying explanation. But Alden stopped him before excitement could become reckless ambition. Ashborn potential had fascinated researchers once, and that fascination killed many of them. Most known Ashborn died before reaching stable, advanced forms. Wrong exposure, poor nutrition, or uncontrolled adaptation could destroy the body entirely. Ash was not secretly guaranteed greatness. He was difficult to keep alive. That hit Ethan harder than learning Ash was secretly high tier ever could. Alden could explain the mechanism, but no complete training manual had survived. Ethan would still need the notebook, only now every entry carried greater stakes. Alden gave him one rule. Never feed Ash something merely because he could swallow it. Every exposure should answer a real weakness or improve a necessary survival trait. Adaptation without direction wasn't progression. It was gambling with Ash's life. Ethan thought about the common beast, blinded by Ash's first smoke cloud. One strange ability had mattered because it solved one immediate problem. Future growth needed the same discipline. Together, Ethan and Alden chose a first test that offered pressure without certain death. Mistfall Crater held lower-tier beasts beyond the safest frontier routes. Its creatures could hurt Ash badly, but retreat was still possible with preparation. Ethan spent most of his savings replacing worn tools and buying emergency supplies. Before leaving, he reviewed the facts: strange digestion, blinding smoke, fast learning, and trust. Everything else would have to be discovered inside Mistfall Crater. Ethan crossed the crater boundary, knowing this was no longer random survival. It was Ash's first deliberate evolution test. Mistfall Crater greeted them with thicker danger than anything surrounding the frontier roads. Ethan slowed down. Better gear did not suddenly make them real hunters. Ash stayed close, his small body disappearing easily among broken stone and brush. Alden's warning stayed in his head. Useful pressure could turn lethal fast. He marked escape routes and watched how local beasts moved through their territory. Ash sniffed scattered materials, but waited more often before trying to eat them. That hesitation pleased Ethan because their earlier practice was becoming real discipline. The goal was no longer to prove Ash could consume almost anything. They needed to discover what kind of adaptation would solve his biggest weakness. That weakness revealed itself whenever heavier beasts forced Ash into direct contact. Smoke created distance, but Ash's fragile body still punished every missed escape. Ethan began searching specifically for creatures whose defenses came from natural toughness. The answer appeared when they first observed a stoneback crawler from concealment. Its hardened body allowed it to absorb punishment that would injure Ash badly. Ethan knew immediately the stoneback was exactly the kind of target they needed. If Ash could inherit even part of that durability, everything else might improve. He could survive longer, stay closer, and use smoke without fleeing instantly. Still, usefulness did not make the stoneback crawler an easy target. Ethan spent time studying when it exposed softer angles during movement. Ash listened to short signals as Ethan guided him toward the first test. The confrontation began badly when the crawler's weight disrupted their planned approach. Ash barely cleared the first charge before stone fragments scattered around him. Ethan called him back instead of forcing an attack from a poor position. They reset, watched again, and waited for the creature to commit forward. This time Ash released smoke before the crawler could line up another charge. The cloud covered its face, but heavy momentum carried the creature onward blindly. Ethan realized smoke alone could not stop something built to keep advancing. He redirected Ash sideways, using blindness to change angle rather than distance. That adjustment created the first opening wide enough to matter against the crawler. Ash struck where the hardened plates gave way to more vulnerable movement. The attack did not finish the beast, but it proved their approach workable. The crawler twisted hard, forcing Ash to give up the opening at once. He resisted and withdrew before excitement became a mistake they could not reverse. The first encounter ended without victory, but it taught them something useful. Ash needed better timing before they could safely challenge the crawler again. Ethan also learned how the beast compensated when smoke stole its vision. He returned later with a cleaner plan built from those observations. The second attempt lasted longer because both sides understood danger more quickly. Ash moved before each heavy charge rather than reacting after momentum already built. Ethan used smoke only when it changed positioning instead of wasting energy repeatedly. Eventually, the stoneback could no longer cover every weak angle at once. Ash exploited the opening Ethan had been waiting for across both encounters. When the struggle ended, Ethan approached carefully rather than celebrating too early. He remembered why they had chosen this creature instead of another target. Ash did not copy whole creatures. He integrated useful traits into his own body. Ethan selected material connected to those hardened plates and offered it cautiously. Ash sniffed the sample before consuming it without the hesitation of earlier meals. For several seconds, nothing visible happened beyond Ash's ordinary breathing. Then the little beast's posture tightened as something changed beneath his scales. Ethan dropped beside him, ready to stop everything if the reaction went wrong. Ash's skin roughened first, losing the soft appearance of his hatchling form. Gray scales thickened into darker plates resembling stone layered across his body. His frame stretched longer, while shoulders and limbs gained noticeably greater mass. Faint scraping followed as fresh armor locked into place across Ash's moving scales. Ash braced against the ground, breathing hard while the changes continued spreading. When the process stopped, he looked nearly twice the size. Ethan remembered. The tiny gray lizard had become a compact, armored beast before his eyes. Ethan opened Ash's status panel with equal parts fear and desperate expectation. For the first time, an actual tier appeared beside Ash's information. Uncommon tier replaced the empty space that had followed him since hatching. Another line finally gave Ash a real evolutionary stage. Ashborn Phase 1 now stood where only unregistered species had appeared before. Ethan read the new status twice because he needed certainty this was real. Ash lifted his head, testing the strange new weight across his body. He stumbled once, corrected himself, then moved with growing confidence afterward. The change mattered because it proved deliberate adaptation could truly shape Ash. Ethan refused to assume the new body worked perfectly without testing it. Turning required different balance now that thick scales protected his flanks and back. Ethan changed his signals instead of forcing Ash to move like his old form. Within days, Ash began using his additional mass rather than fighting against it. Ash's first real power spike proved itself when another hostile beast charged them. An impact Ash once would have avoided struck across his armored side. Ethan flinched, expecting the familiar panic of a serious injury afterward. Ash slid across the ground, but recovered before the attacker could capitalize. The stone-like plating had absorbed punishment his old body could never tolerate. Ethan changed tactics immediately. Running was no longer their only safe option. Ash used smoke at closer range, staying inside the battle longer than before. His new durability bought seconds, and those seconds created better offensive opportunities. They escaped the encounter without needing a desperate flight back toward town. That result meant more to Ethan than the word uncommon on any screen. Evolution had changed what Ash could survive under genuine combat pressure. The new form widened the range of materials Ethan and Ash could gather safely. Better hauls finally paid enough for sturdier gear and real recovery between hunts. Under Professor Alden's guidance, Ash's feeding became deliberate instead of experimental. Every new material now had to solve a weakness or answer a useful question. Their notes confirmed Ash extracted traits instead of copying entire creatures outright. Stoneback armor proved those traits could integrate into Ash's existing developing body. That meant future adaptations might stack instead of replacing everything that came before. Professor Alden warned that stacking power could also destabilize Ash if rushed. Ethan accepted the rule immediately. Progression meant nothing if Ash could not survive it. Ash, meanwhile, grew more confident inside the heavier Phase 1 body. He ranged farther, noticed danger earlier, and still checked back toward Ethan. The partnership no longer felt like protecting a helpless hatchling from everything. Now, Ethan could depend on Ash when real problems appeared around them. Frontier merchants noticed the change almost as quickly as Ethan did. Some remembered the tiny lizard that once had no tear at all. Better sales brought comfort, but they also brought far more questions. Ethan learned how quickly harmless curiosity could become interest in ownership. Professor Alden warned that a unique beast never stayed obscure forever. So Ethan focused on fundamentals instead of forcing another power spike. Ash practiced entering his own smoke without losing orientation inside the cloud. Ethan practiced signaling direction before visibility disappeared around both of them. Armor let Ash survive closer exchanges without turning every mistake into disaster. Smoke and durability became a simple style: disrupt, endure, then counter. Ethan liked it because the style matched Ash instead of copying Academy beasts. Progress came faster whenever he stopped wishing. Ash behaved like familiar species. Those weeks also gave Ethan something he had never enjoyed before. For once, every meal was not balanced against tomorrow's hunger. Ash rested properly between hunts instead of following endless gathering trips. The quiet improvement made their earlier life feel farther away than expected. Yet Professor Alden kept reminding Ethan that visibility would eventually bring pressure. A rare, unknown beast was valuable precisely because nobody understood its ceiling. Ethan knew that attention could become dangerous long before Ash reached another phase. For now, Mistfall Crater gave them room to keep improving outside Iron Crest control. Frontier merchants had already mentioned an Iron Crest field team arriving that week. The same name Ethan had once ignored at the academy surfaced again: Damien Cross. Then one morning, that distance from Iron Crest suddenly disappeared. A group of young academy tamers entered the frontier hunting region together. Their equipment alone revealed access to resources Ethan had never possessed. They moved with the confidence of people raised inside a polished system. Ethan felt the old rejection stir before he could stop it. Ash bumped lightly against his leg and pulled his attention back. Ethan had no reason to compete with strangers simply because their paths differed. He turned away, intending to continue the hunt like any other morning. That would have worked if one particular student had simply ignored him. Instead, Damien Cross noticed the unusual armored beast before Ethan could leave. And beside Damien walked an epic tier thunder wolf, crackling with controlled electricity. That epic tier alone made the power gap obvious before the fight started. Electric energy moved across its body with control Ash had never encountered before. Ethan understood the gap before Damien said anything about their relative standing. Phase 1 was a real power spike, but Ash was still badly outclassed by epic tier. He looked over Ash's armored form and reacted with obvious skepticism rather than interest. Ethan tried ending the conversation before it became another performance for spectators. Damien turned the comparison into a public challenge between their beasts. Other Iron Crest students gathered quickly because the matchup looked absurdly one-sided. Ethan knew refusing might be sensible, yet part of him wanted real information. Thunderwolf brought a level of pressure Ash had never faced in Mistfall Crater. If handled safely, even defeat might teach them where Phase 1 truly failed. Ethan accepted only after deciding he would stop before Ash faced needless danger. Ethan entered knowing this fight would show exactly how brutal the power gap was. Ash lowered his armored body while the Thunderwolf watched him without visible concern. The opening movement confirmed Ethan's fear before either beast exchanged serious damage. Thunderwolf was dramatically faster than opponents Ash had learned to disrupt nearby. The epic beast closed distance before Ethan's usual timing could develop cleanly. Ash released smoke, but lightning flashed through the cloud before he repositioned safely. The strike caught his armored side and forced him backward across the ground. Stoneback durability prevented immediate collapse, proving Phase 1 still mattered enormously. Yet surviving one epic attack did not make Ash capable of answering equally. Damien Cross pressed the advantage while Ethan tried changing angles inside the spreading smoke. Thunderwolf reacted too quickly for the tactic that confused weaker frontier beasts. Electric attacks kept forcing Ash away from positions Ethan wanted to create. The battle became less about winning and more about preventing dangerous accumulated damage. Ethan searched for one opening where Ash could make the epic beast respect him. Ash charged through smoke and reached closer than Damien Cross seemed to expect. For an instant, armored weight threatened to turn contact into a real collision. Thunderwolf pivoted away and answered with another burst of concentrated electricity. The attack drove through Ash's defenses and finally broke his remaining momentum. Ethan stopped the match before pride could turn a clear defeat into serious injury. Damien's victory was immediate, public, and impossible for anyone there to dispute. The watching students laughed at how quickly the supposed frontier curiosity had fallen. Ethan ignored them and reached Ash before listening to anything Damien Cross said. Ash breathed hard, scales marked by the force his armor could not absorb. Ethan checked him carefully, angered more by himself than by the spectators. He had wanted information, and the price almost became higher than intended. Ash leaned against Ethan once, as if refusing to let the loss separate them. Ethan carried that image away from the Iron Crest group and back toward safety. Ash needed time to recover before Ethan could even evaluate what happened. Professor Alden examined Ash and found no sign the electrical exposure was still harming him. That relief allowed Ethan to return finally to the notebook beside Ash. He documented speed differences, failed smoke timing, and where armor had helped. Then he noticed something strange during Ash's recovery from the electric strikes. Tiny sparks flickered beneath damaged scales, then vanished before Ethan could study them. Ethan assumed residual energy until the same phenomenon returned much later. Ash's body seemed to be retaining a trace of what Thunderwolf had delivered. Professor Alden leaned closer when Ethan described the repeated electrical response afterward. Neither wanted to claim adaptation before enough evidence existed to support it. Still, that tiny adaptation completely changed what the loss meant. Ash had not consumed Thunderwolf material, yet exposure itself seemed to matter. If true, Devour and Adapt was a far more broken mechanic than Ethan realized. A survived attack could leave information inside Ash even without victory. The idea was dangerous because it could encourage the worst kind of recklessness. It only meant some losses could leave useful changes if Ash endured them. That distinction became the foundation of Ethan's next stage of training. He stopped judging every practice session solely by whether Ash won cleanly. Ethan started choosing fights that pushed Ash hard without trapping them in hopeless battles. Ethan learned to recognize when useful exposure was becoming simple, unnecessary punishment. The faint electrical response never turned Ash into another Thunderwolf overnight. Still, and now knew, every survived struggle might become part of Ash later. It also raised a question Professor Alden Reed could not answer from surviving records. How many different adaptations could one Ashborn carry before needing deeper evolution? Professor Alden admitted the lost history might contain answers modern research no longer held. Then he mentioned an ancient location connected directly to Ashborn generations before extinction. Its name was Ashen Vault, and reaching it would demand everything they had learned. Professor Alden Reed unfolded an old map whose markings had survived better than its explanations. Records connected the place with Ashborn that lived before the lineage disappeared. Some fragments suggested the site preserved evidence about deeper developmental stages. Professor Alden believed an ancient remnant there might trigger dormant bloodline memory. He stressed that belief was theory, not a promise waiting for confirmation. Reaching the vault meant crossing 3 dangerous ecological layers before finding the ruin. Each layer pushed farther beyond the low-level hunting Ethan could currently manage. Ethan spent days comparing supplies against the risks written around the old notes. His improved earnings bought better gear, though nothing resembling Iron Crest Academy expedition equipment. He reinforced packs, replaced worn boots, and prepared more carefully than ever. Ash trained with his heavier Phase 1 body during every remaining safe day. Ethan wanted turning, smoke, timing, and recovery to feel automatic under stress. The faint lightning adaptation was still unreliable, so Ethan refused to build around it. A promising trait meant nothing until Ash could reproduce it reliably. Before departure, Professor Alden repeated the warning. Ethan already understood deeply. Ashen Vault might reveal the Ashborn past, but it could also kill them. Ethan looked at Ash and considered staying near Mistfall Crater indefinitely instead. They could earn money, improve slowly, and avoid chasing a forgotten mystery. Yet every current answer pointed toward a ceiling they still could not explain. Ash's body carried several adaptations without any known path toward deeper stability. If the lineage had left instructions anywhere, the vault was their best chance. Ethan chose the expedition because ignorance had become its own dangerous limitation. Ash followed him from Professor Alden's home without hesitation or visible concern. The first ecological layer immediately punished the idea that better equipment meant safety. He kept Ash close and avoided confrontations, offering nothing relevant to survival. Every unnecessary fight consumed energy they would need farther along the route. The map guided them forward while the environment tested every habit learned earlier. Ash's armor proved valuable when rough impacts caught him during narrow escapes. Smoke was still their best escape tool whenever a direct fight gave them no edge. Ethan used it sparingly because exhaustion could be as dangerous as injury. Conditions grew harsher, and mistakes became expensive before either could correct them. One bad encounter tore open part of Ethan's pack and scattered valuable supplies. He recovered what he could while Ash held position between him and danger. They escaped, but the missing equipment changed every remaining calculation afterward. Ethan seriously considered turning back while retreat was still possible. Ash stood beside the damaged pack, watching him with the same steady attention. The decision could not be made through pride, because Ash's life mattered equally. Ethan checked their remaining supplies and continued only after confirming they had enough. The second layer forced them into more encounters than Ethan wanted to accept. Some threats could be avoided, while others blocked the route completely. Ash began reacting differently when the same kind of pressure returned repeatedly. Ethan recorded those changes whenever they found enough safety to stop briefly. Near the end of the second layer, another mistake cost them more equipment. The third ecological layer felt different, because retreat now seemed almost equally dangerous. The vault had become not only the goal, but their clearest destination for shelter. Ash was stronger than the hatchling who left town, yet not remotely invincible. One severe encounter pushed his stone armor close to what it could endure. Ethan pulled him away with barely enough time before another impact landed. They escaped, but Ash limped afterward and refused food for several hours. Ethan's fear returned instantly because Ashborn history made every strange symptom frightening. He stopped the expedition despite the distance remaining, and focused on recovery. There was no glory in reaching ancient knowledge with a dying companion. Ethan rested beside Ash, checking breathing and damaged plates throughout the night. By morning, Ash finally drank water and managed a little food. Relief hit Ethan harder than any successful hunt had ever managed before. The delay burned precious supplies, but pushing onward would have been worse. When Ash finally stood comfortably, Ethan resumed movement at a slower pace. Ash adapted gradually as the third layer kept pressuring his recovering body. He also reacted faster when hazards resembled situations that hurt him earlier. Those improvements were small, but small improvements kept them alive repeatedly. Even without a new tier, Ash kept adapting to every danger along the route. Survival itself could show what Ash had learned from everything behind him. At last, ancient structures appeared ahead where Ethan expected only more uncertainty. The sight stopped him because it confirmed Professor Alden's map was not fantasy. Ashen Vault existed, weathered and silent, beyond the three punishing ecological layers. Ethan reached its entrance with damaged equipment and almost no emotional energy left. Ash stood beside him, scarred, tired, and visibly tougher than when they started. Neither had crossed that distance for treasure they could simply sell afterward. They had come because Ash's species had once left answers somewhere inside. Ethan entered slowly, expecting the old ruins to hide unfamiliar dangers. He found evidence that Ashborn had truly existed here long before modern records. Fragments of their history survived without offering one complete training guide. Then they found the object that changed the entire expedition's meaning. A fossilized fragment from an ancient Ashborn had survived inside the vault. Ethan knew the fossil mattered before he had any idea what it might unlock. Ash reacted before Ethan even decided whether approaching it was safe. His whole body went still as if something older than instinct had awakened. The response looked nothing like ordinary curiosity toward a material he might eat. Ash stepped closer slowly, eyes fixed on the ancient remnant without distraction. Ethan remembered Professor Alden's theory about dormant bloodline memory inside living Ashborn. If that theory was right, this fossil could connect Ash with lost ancestry. If it was wrong, nobody could predict how an adaptive body might react. Ethan nearly stopped Ash before noticing the beast was choosing the approach himself. Trust demanded more than issuing commands whenever uncertainty made Ethan afraid. He stayed close, ready to intervene, while allowing Ash the final step. The moment Ash touched the fossil, his entire body tightened violently. Ethan heard a low scraping sound from scales shifting against one another. The stone-like armor along Ash's back darkened before new heat moved beneath it. His breathing deepened, and the air around him filled with drifting ash. This was nothing like the slower physical thickening during the stoneback evolution. The change reached deeper, altering Ash's silhouette from the foundation outward. His limbs lengthened while his torso expanded into a stronger draconic frame. The armored scales became more refined, instead of simply growing thicker everywhere. Ethan backed away only enough to give the transformation room to continue. Then two ridges along Ash's back began unfolding into completely new structures. Bone and membrane extended outward while Ash swirled around the developing shapes. A pair of wings opened where no wings had existed seconds earlier. Ethan forgot his exhaustion because the sight made breathing difficult for another reason. The tiny lizard from the gray egg was becoming something unmistakably draconic. Ash lowered himself as the new weight settled through his changing body. The fossil beneath his claws cracked slightly as the reaction reached its peak. Then Ash's status panel updated with information far beyond Phase 1. Ashborn Phase 2 appeared as the new evolutionary stage before Ethan. A second designation gave the transformed beast a specific form name. Cinder Drake now identified the winged creature standing inside Ashen Vault. His tier jumped too, climbing from uncommon all the way to rare plus. Ethan stared at the display because every earlier humiliation suddenly felt distant. Ethan saw a survivor, shaped by every controlled adaptation that had brought him here. He saw an Ashborn that survived enough guided adaptation to reach another phase. The fossil had awakened lineage potential, but the journey prepared Ash to survive it. Every lost piece of equipment and every controlled adaptation mattered to this moment. Ash moved one wing experimentally and nearly knocked loose debris beside him. Ethan laughed from sheer relief when the awkward movement surprised them both. A more serious test came after they found enough open space nearby. Ash extended both wings, pushed hard, and lifted only briefly from the ground. He landed badly, skidded, and stared back as though offended by gravity. Ethan kept smiling, even though Ash barely knew how to use those wings. The next attempt lasted longer before Ash touched down with better balance. By the fourth attempt, Ash circled Ethan once before landing with shaky control. Places once unreachable from the ground suddenly belonged within Ash's possible movement. Ethan also noticed how different the stronger body handled its own armored weight. The Cinder Drake form integrated durability instead of dragging heavy plates awkwardly. That power spike changed mobility, reach, body structure, and every tactic available to them. Ethan spent time helping Ash practice landing before attempting anything ambitious outside. An inexperienced flyer could die faster than a cautious ground beast in danger. Ash learned quickly, but Ethan never confused quick learning with complete mastery. They searched the vault for anything else supporting Professor Alden's surviving theories. Ethan copied what information he could preserve before beginning the journey back. Leaving Ashen Vault felt different because Ash could now scout short distances airborne. Ethan still prevented him from flying recklessly across unknown threats below them. Short controlled flights revealed routes that would have been invisible from ground level. That advantage reduced several risks which nearly trapped them during the approach. Those wings instantly gave them safer routes and far more movement options. Even with the upgrade, crossing the third layer was still dangerous. Ethan had no interest in flexing rare. Plus, if it got Ash killed, Ash was stronger, but every environment still contained threats they barely understood. His new wings also required energy that limited how long he could remain airborne. Ethan adjusted travel around those limits instead of demanding continuous flight. The beast gradually learned when flying solved problems and when walking saved strength. That judgment became another form of coordination developing between them. Naturally, across the second layer, their changed silhouette drew different reactions from wild beasts. Some threats that approached Phase 1 Ash more confidently now hesitated longer. Ethan used that hesitation to avoid fights instead of interpreting it as invitation. They were trying to get home with answers, not flex Ash's rare plus power. Ash's flight was smoother, though landing still required attention on uneven ground. Ethan found himself remembering the tiny hatchling struggling simply to survive common threats. Yet every change remained traceable through events Ethan had recorded carefully. The hatchling had been fragile, unknown, and genuinely vulnerable for a long time. When the frontier finally came back into view, Ethan felt relief before pride. He had nearly lost Ash and more supplies than he wanted to count. They returned alive, carrying evidence that the forgotten Ashborn path still continued. Professor Alden saw the Cinder Drake from a distance and stopped moving. For several seconds, he could only stare at the wings and altered frame. Ethan presented the copied records before explaining how the fossil triggered Phase 2. Professor Alden Reed listened carefully, asking whether any other material had been consumed there. Ethan confirmed the major change followed direct contact with the ancient Ashborn remnant. That detail strengthened the theory that bloodline memory had survived inside the species. It also created new questions neither of them could answer from existing evidence. Why had Ash survived a transition historical Ashborn often failed to reach? Could future evolution require integration of everything Ash had already absorbed? Professor Alden refused to guess beyond what the current evidence could support. Meanwhile, word of the Cinder Drake spread across the frontier fast. A winged rare plus beast was far harder to overlook than Phase 1 Ash. Merchants who knew Ethan repeated the story to travelers from larger settlements. Some described the beast accurately, while others exaggerated details Ethan never claimed. He tried limiting attention, but rumors traveled faster than careful corrections ever could. The name Cinder Drake became attached to Ash beyond the small market area. Merchants paid Ethan more because his results had become impossible to dismiss. That benefit came paired with people asking increasingly pointed questions about ownership. Where had Ethan registered the species, and which institution had approved it? Who had authorized the evolution of an undocumented Ashborn bloodline? Ethan had no comfortable answers, because the system had rejected him from the start. Professor Alden warned that official attention was coming whether Ethan wanted it or not. Once tier and uniqueness overlapped, powerful people had reasons to intervene directly. Ethan hoped visible success might finally make the Iron Crest Academy reconsider its earlier rejection. Ethan was about to learn that being noticed was nothing like being respected. Iron Crest representatives arrived after confirming Ash could no longer be dismissed. Instead, the officials zeroed in on Ash's status as undocumented wildlife. They acknowledged Rare Plus without acknowledging Ethan's right to keep Ash. Their reasoning twisted the same uncertainty once used to deny Ethan admission. Because Ash was still unregistered, they claimed the state had custody rights. The words sounded administrative, but their meaning was simple enough for Ethan. Iron Crest Academy intended to take Ash away and study him under official control. Ethan reminded them nobody wanted the gray egg when destruction was scheduled. No official had studied Ash when he lacked tier, skills, or obvious value. Ash was valuable now, so uncertainty suddenly required government protection and supervision. The people who abandoned him wanted authority after Ethan kept him alive. Ethan refused before the officials finished, explaining how surrender would supposedly help everyone. Ash stepped closer to Ethan as tension sharpened across the room. The representatives warned that refusal could turn a registration dispute into legal pursuit. Ethan knew they had more trained beasts, more backing, and far more institutional power. He also understood surrendering peacefully would end the partnership more completely than losing. Professor Alden Reed could not protect them against the Iron Crest Academy's full authority openly. Ethan had only one realistic option before officials returned with greater force. He packed essentials, abandoned everything unnecessary, and prepared to disappear from familiar roads. Ash tested his wings outside while Ethan reviewed routes beyond the frontier market. This time, Ethan and Ash were not hunting answers. They were running for freedom. The Iron Crest Academy had ignored Ethan when he needed help and noticed him after success. Now, that attention threatened to take away the reason he had survived everything. Ethan left before dawn, with Ash moving silently through the darkness beside him. Iron Crest returned to Professor Alden before sunrise. They questioned him for hours, searched his study, and placed his home under observation. The warning was simple: help Ethan again, and they would call it obstruction. Alden gave them nothing useful, but helping Ethan finally carried a visible price. Behind them waited Iron Crest officials who believed an unregistered beast belonged to institutions. Ahead waited a world that would soon learn the Cinder Drake's name. And for the first time, Ethan and Ash were no longer merely outsiders. Ethan knew running meant giving up the fragile stability built near Mistfall Crater. Ash flew short stretches while Ethan moved beneath cover whenever terrain allowed it. The Cinder Drake's wings were invaluable, but also impossible to hide indefinitely. Ethan limited flight near populated roads and traveled at inconvenient hours whenever possible. That caution cost them speed, and eventually Iron Crest trackers closed the gap. The first sign came when Ash stopped suddenly and focused behind their route. Ethan trusted Ash instantly and moved before he even saw the threat. Moments later, distant pursuit confirmed Ash had sensed danger before Ethan could. The trackers were trained Iron Crest tamers, accustomed to coordinated pursuit with contracted companions. Ethan changed direction, using terrain and Ash's limited flight to break sightlines. Smoke covered one narrow escape when an Iron Crest Academy beast approached too quickly. Ash released the cloud, then climbed above it before the pursuer adjusted. Ethan used the confusion to cross ground that would otherwise expose him completely. The tactic worked once, but trained opponents learned from repeated patterns too. Ethan could not rely on the same smoke and flight combination forever. The pursuit stretched across hours, exhausting Ash faster than controlled training ever had. Repeated takeoffs drained energy while Ethan pushed his own body beyond comfort. Ethan realized this chase created a kind of pressure unlike any previous hunt. Wild beasts defended territory or pursued prey until risk became unacceptable. Iron Crest trackers could rotate teams and keep coming because this was an official capture. Ash had never needed to adapt against an organized enemy before now. Ash began using short climbs instead of wasting strength on long continuous flight. Ethan started releasing smoke only when multiple escape routes already existed nearby. They learned to create uncertainty rather than depending on complete concealment every time. Several pursuit attempts failed because Ethan refused to repeat yesterday's safest pattern. Iron Crest kept closing every escape route until a direct fight became unavoidable. Two contracted beasts finally cornered them, where retreat offered no clean path. Ethan saw the problem instantly. Outrunning both beasts would leave him exposed. Ash lowered his body, wings half open, waiting for the signal to engage. This fight carried no tournament rules and no supervising official ready to stop damage. If Ash fell, the Iron Crest Academy would take him whether Ethan agreed or not. Ethan focused on one thing: create a clean opening and get out. The two opposing beasts attacked from different angles to limit Cinder Drake mobility. Ash launched upward, but one opponent forced him lower before altitude became useful. The second pressed from the side, making a safe landing nearly impossible. Ethan called for smoke beneath Ash instead of around the pursuing beasts. The cloud hid the landing point and disrupted their attempt to coordinate below. Ash dropped through his own cover, turning sharply once his feet touched ground. One attacker followed too aggressively and entered the smoke before correcting course. Ash struck during that confusion, using his heavier draconic body at close range. The hit opened space, but the second beast punished Ash for committing. Ash was knocked sideways, wings scraping ground before he recovered his footing. Ethan felt the old fear from Damien's Thunderwolf return in a harsher form. This was pressure from different opponents arriving too quickly for one answer. Ash endured another exchange, and something unusual began happening beneath his scales. The body did not enter the dramatic transformation Ethan remembered from Ashen Vault. Instead, existing structures tightened as if several adaptations were reorganizing under stress. His reactions sharpened, while damaged areas seemed to stabilize more quickly than expected. Ethan noticed tiny changes in how Ash handled attacks from both sides. The Cinder Drake started adjusting to each unfamiliar hit faster than before. One beast pressured him, and Ash's very next reaction already looked different. The second beast created a different response that layered over the first. Ethan realized Devour and Adapt was working in real time during the fight. This adaptation looked stronger than the small traces discovered after Thunderwolf exposure, but the status panel still refused to call it Phase 3 or a new tier. Whatever was happening belonged somewhere between stable stages of his evolution. Ethan did not need a clean label to see the combat edge it gave Ash. The same trap that worked earlier was already becoming less effective. That allowed Ethan to change from pure defense toward a coordinated breakthrough attempt. He waited until both opponents committed again, then signaled Ash toward one side. Ash charged as though trying to overpower the nearer beast directly. At the last moment, smoke exploded across the space behind that target. The second pursuer lost visual contact with the first inside the sudden cloud. Ash used the separation to push past instead of staying to finish anyone. Ethan moved through the opening while both Iron Crest Academy beasts tried regrouping behind them. The escape almost worked cleanly until another attack reached Ethan from outside his vision. He heard movement too late and had no time to clear the path. Ash was already several strides ahead, with the safest route open before him. Ethan shouted a command meant to keep the beast moving away from danger. For the first time, Ash ignored the command, and Ethan knew exactly why. The Cinder Drake turned back without hesitation and placed himself between them. The incoming attack struck Ash instead of reaching Ethan's exposed position. His body jerked under the force, but the new adaptive resilience held. Ethan froze for one heartbeat because no order had told Ash to return. This was not trained obedience. Ash had made the choice himself. Ash had chosen Ethan over the escape route when separation would be safer. The gesture connected instantly with the gray hatchling Ethan once refused to abandon. Back then, Ethan protected a creature everyone else considered disposable. Now, that creature was protecting Ethan despite knowing the risk physically. Ethan forced emotion aside long enough to keep the sacrifice from becoming wasted. He redirected Ash through the opening created by the block and smoke. The pair broke free before the Iron Crest Academy beasts recovered coordinated pursuit completely. They ran until Ash could no longer maintain even short bursts of flight. Ethan found cover and checked every injured section of the Cinder Drake's body. The damage was serious enough to frighten him, but Ash remained conscious. Even after the danger passed, that strange half-step evolution was still there. The status panel offered no name for the partial step, only a stronger Phase 2 body. Ethan logged it as a step beyond normal rare power, but not Phase 3. Something had shifted, but the complete next evolutionary threshold had not arrived. What mattered was simple. Ash survived pressure that should have crushed him, and Ash had made a choice no status panel could ever measure. Ethan's trust in Ash changed after that moment because their bond became reciprocal publicly. He no longer wondered whether the creature simply followed the person who fed him. Ash had chosen danger specifically because Ethan stood inside its path. The Iron Crest Academy pursuit continued afterward, but the story had already begun spreading widely. Witnesses along routes had seen the unusual Cinder Drake avoiding official capture. Reports described a young tamer whose unregistered beast fought Iron Crest companions successfully. Every retelling made hiding harder while also making quiet confiscation more complicated. The Iron Crest Academy could control records, but it could not erase every frontier witness. Ethan understood that visibility had become both a threat and potential protection. If enough people saw Ethan as Ash's real tamer, Iron Crest's claim would start cracking. But running forever would never turn rumors into real protection. Ethan returned secretly to Professor Alden because they needed another kind of plan. Alden listened while Ethan described how close the latest capture attempt came. Ethan lacked forces to challenge an institution, and Ash still needed recovery. They needed a public arena where skill could turn into undeniable legitimacy. Professor Alden mentioned one event operating outside ordinary Iron Crest background requirements. The Valoria Open accepted tamers without demanding noble lineage or Iron Crest credentials. Competitors registered themselves and their beasts directly through the tournament's open structure. More importantly, entering would place Ash before thousands of witnesses under formal rules. Confiscating him quietly would become much harder if the world saw their partnership. Ethan saw the risk immediately. Registering publicly also told Iron Crest exactly where he was. The Iron Crest Academy would know exactly where to find him once he appeared. Every round would become a deadline before political pressure closed around them again. Ash would also face opponents stronger than anything in their frontier routines. It was a real test, demanding everything Phase 2 and later adaptation provided. He looked at the beast resting nearby and understood another uncomfortable truth. A life spent permanently fleeing would trap Ash as surely as official custody. They needed the right to exist openly, simply another temporary hiding place. Ethan decided to enter the Valoria Open and force the question publicly. He prepared, knowing this choice could end pursuit or bring it directly closer. Ash recovered gradually while Ethan refined every reliable ability available right now. Smoke still worked, but tournament opponents would learn that trick fast. Flight was a huge combat edge, but Ash could not stay airborne forever. Stone-derived armor still absorbed punishment even beneath the Cinder Drake's evolved form. The intermediate adaptation improved resilience without granting Ethan a named new skill. Ethan refused to pretend Ash could command lightning like Damien's epic beast. He could only handle electrical pressure better than during their first encounter. Ethan practiced combinations rather than chasing another evolution. Before the tournament began, smoke followed by short flight created sudden changes in vertical positioning. Grounded armored charges worked better after opponents expected Ash to remain airborne. Short aerial movements conserved strength while forcing enemies to track more angles. Small gestures mattered because arena noise could easily bury ordinary spoken instructions. Ash learned those cues through repetition until several responses became almost immediate. Training strengthened their bond because Ethan trusted Ash to interpret more context independently. They were solving combat problems as a pair with different information available. Before registration, Alden mentioned one concern Ethan could not train around. Rumors said powerful private backers were pressuring officials around the Open's later bracket. There were no names and no proof. Only enough smoke to make Alden uneasy. Registration day arrived with more attention than Ethan wanted around his identity. Valoria Open officials examined Ash's unusual status before accepting the entry. The Open accepted Ethan as a real competitor, while Ironcrest's claim remained unresolved. Still, paperwork meant nothing if Ethan failed in the first round. He needed performance strong enough to make separation from Ash look absurd. Ethan treated every match as another exercise in reading patterns before committing Ash. The first opponent expected Cinder Drake Flight to define the entire fighting style. Ethan surprised them by keeping Ash grounded through much of the opening exchange. His armored body absorbed pressure while smoke gradually controlled available sightlines around them. Only after the opponent committed forward did Ash use a short vertical burst. The sudden change of angle created enough confusion to decide the match safely. Ethan advanced without revealing everything Ash could currently do under prolonged pressure. The next match forced more movement because staying grounded became less effective. Ash alternated brief flights with abrupt landings to prevent predictable pursuit patterns. Smoke-covered transitions rather than being used as a simple emergency escape. The strategy cost energy, but Ethan managed the pace before exhaustion became dangerous. Another victory placed his name deeper inside the public tournament bracket. Ironcrest could no longer dismiss Ash as an uncontrolled creature. Nobody understood. Thousands watched him respond to Ethan's signals inside formal combat rules repeatedly. Every successful exchange became evidence that their partnership was stable and genuine. Ethan still felt pressure because attention also invited opponents to study earlier matches. By later rounds, smoke surprised nobody who had watched the tournament carefully. Competitors began waiting for Ash's usual repositioning before committing their strongest pressure. Ethan answered by delaying familiar patterns until opponents revealed their counter first. The matches became more tactical because secrecy disappeared with repeated public exposure. Now, Ash stood before thousands without losing attention on the person guiding him. That stability made Ethan prouder than hearing strangers call Cinder Drake impressive. Another round pushed Ash close to exhaustion without producing serious injury. Ethan deliberately slowed the final exchanges instead of chasing a flashy finish. He waited for the opponent to create the opening rather than spending Ash's reserves. When it came, one controlled burst ended the match and preserved recovery time. It also kept Ash healthy enough for the next stage of competition. The bracket narrowed, and one familiar name moved steadily closer from another side. Damian Cross had entered the Valoria Open with the same epic tier Thunderwolf as before. Ethan watched from a distance and instantly recognized the old pressure. Thunderwolf was still fast, disciplined, and brutal enough to punish one bad move. Ash watched too, electricity flickering faintly beneath several scales as memory returned. Ethan had studied that battle more carefully than any victory from Mistfall Crater. He remembered where smoke failed, where Thunderwolf's speed broke their timing completely. He remembered stopping before Ash suffered damage that pride could never justify. Most importantly, he remembered the tiny electrical adaptation lingering after the loss. The tournament bracket finally confirmed what spectators had begun hoping to see. Ethan and Damian would face each other again before the final stage. News of the rematch spread quickly because their earlier mismatch was already known. Ethan ignored predictions because neither side would be fighting the past directly. Thunderwolf was still epic, while Ash had climbed to Rare Plus with layered adaptations. Now, the Cinder Drake had flight, heavier armor, and far cleaner coordination with Ethan. None of those improvements guaranteed victory against a beast that once dominated completely. The night before the match, Ethan reviewed the old notebook from their first defeat. He compared those notes against everything Ash could reliably do in the present. Ash once depended on smoke, mainly to escape stronger pressure before being overwhelmed. Now, smoke was one tool inside a broader style built around movement and durability. Ash once had no answer for Thunderwolf's speed beyond desperate reaction. Now, flight could force the epic beast to attack across different vertical angles. Back then, Ash had no real answer for electrical damage beyond enduring it. Now, his biology had encountered that pressure enough to react without immediate panic. Thunderwolf could injure Ash badly if they treated remembered pain like solved danger. Ethan closed the notebook and rested his hand against Ash's warm scales. Morning brought a crowd far larger than the one that watched their first battle. Damian entered with Thunderwolf beside him, confident, but no longer openly dismissive. He had seen enough tournament footage to understand Ash was not the same beast. Thunderwolf's first electric burst reminded everyone why epic tier was no joke. Ash lowered his body, wings ready, while Ethan waited for the opening movement. Neither side rushed into the exact pattern that defined their earlier confrontation. The first exchange would reveal who had learned more from everything since then. Ethan gave a short signal, and Ash moved before Thunderwolf committed forward. The rematch began with both tamers treating the other as genuinely dangerous. Thunderwolf accelerated first, trying to recreate the speed advantage that once ended everything. Ash answered with a short upward burst instead of retreating across the ground. Lightning cut through the space below him, where Phase 1 Ash once stood. Ethan saw it instantly. Wings had turned an old weakness into a real combat edge. Damien adjusted without hesitation, redirecting Thunderwolf before Ash could attack downward safely. The epic beast moved laterally, forcing Ash to land without a clean angle. Ash touched down and released smoke before Thunderwolf could pressure the landing point. Electric light flashed inside the cloud, briefly revealing both beasts as distorted silhouettes. Thunderwolf burst through the smoke from a direction Ethan had predicted incorrectly. Its attack caught Ash across one shoulder and spun him half around. This time, Ash recovered before Thunderwolf could chain the next hit. The old electrical exposure had not erased damage, but it reduced shock and panic. Ethan signaled a grounded charge, while Damien Cross expected another aerial retreat. Ash drove forward through fading smoke with his armored body leading the collision. Thunderwolf avoided the center, yet Ash clipped its side hard enough to matter. For the first time across both battles, Damien's beast gave ground under contact. Damien switched tempo, using Thunderwolf's speed to exploit Ash's wider turning radius. The tactic pressured the Cinder Drake's heavier body in exactly the right place. Ethan responded by keeping Ash near the smoke, instead of chasing every movement. If Thunderwolf wanted clean speed, it would have to enter uncertain visibility again. Damien saw the trap and started poking from outside instead of diving in. Ethan preferred that because Ash's endurance mattered more during repeated aerial exchanges. He waited until Thunderwolf committed lightning into the smoke without confirming Ash's position. Ash launched from another edge, using the flash itself to mask his ascent. The Cinder Drake came down behind Thunderwolf before Damien Cross could fully redirect it. Ash's strike landed across the epic beast's rear flank and broke its rhythm. Thunderwolf recovered, but now, both beasts had taken real damage. The rematch had become exactly what their first encounter never managed to be. It was balanced enough that every decision could change who controlled momentum next. Thunderwolf increased electrical pressure until flashes filled the arena around Ash repeatedly. Some strikes hit armor, while others forced Ash to abandon planned attack routes. The old adaptation helped him remain functional without turning electricity into harmless light. Ash signaled readiness with a sharp movement before Ethan issued another command. That initiative showed how far their communication had advanced beyond simple obedience. Ethan trusted it and changed the next sequence around what Ash already intended. Smoke spread low while Ash remained visible above it for one deliberate second. Damien Cross directed Thunderwolf upward, expecting another flight-based attack from the open angle. Ash instead dropped straight into his own smoke before the leap could connect. Thunderwolf entered after him, but visibility vanished the instant both crossed the cloud. Ethan used a short signal practice specifically for moments when sight disappeared. Ash pivoted inside the smoke and let Thunderwolf's momentum carry it past. His armored body struck from the side as the epic beast tried correcting direction. The collision forced Thunderwolf outside the cloud and briefly onto unstable footing. Ethan saw it, the first real finishing window their setup had created. Ash followed before Damien Cross could reset the spacing that made Thunderwolf strongest. One final coordinated sequence overwhelmed the epic beast enough to end the match. The arena erupted because the result reversed a defeat many spectators remembered clearly. Ethan stood still for a moment while Ash remained focused on Thunderwolf. He waited until tournament officials confirmed the battle had ended beyond dispute. Ethan approached Ash first, checking damage before allowing relief to reach him fully. The Cinder Drake was exhausted, scorched, and bruised beneath several armored sections. He was also standing where Phase 1 Ash once could not stand at all. Smoke was no longer an escape trick. Ethan now used it to shape the battlefield. Their bond turned those separate advantages into one coordinated fighting style. Damien did not make excuses. He knelt beside Thunderwolf and checked its breathing first. Then he looked at Ethan, gave one short nod, and said, "Nothing cruel." The contempt was gone. Damien finally treated the victory as something Ethan had earned. For the first time, official recognition stopped feeling impossible. It also raised the danger waiting in the final stages of the Open. Smoke timing, aerial feints, grounded charges, and defensive limits were no longer secrets. So Ethan spent recovery studying his own matches like an enemy would. Ethan could not invent new abilities simply because later rounds became harder. He had to squeeze more value from the tools Ash could already use reliably. Another round tested exactly that discipline when the opponent refused to chase smoke. Ethan changed plans rather than forcing his preferred tactic against someone prepared for it. Ash stayed more mobile, using short movements to create mistakes without obscuring everything. When the opponent finally overcommitted, Ash used one decisive burst to secure victory. The next round demanded greater durability because avoiding contact became impossible for stretches. Ash's body absorbed punishment while Ethan searched for a safe rhythm to change. The intermediate adaptation from Iron Crest Academy, Pursuit, helped him recover between heavy exchanges. Ethan advanced again, with Ash still healthy enough to continue toward the final. Those earlier rumors finally stopped sounding like tournament gossip. Alden traced the pressure to an underground organization influencing the Open's final bracket. The last opponent carried backing and power on a completely different level. Worse, the final opponent commanded a legendary tier beast. In raw power, Legendary sat miles above a rare plus Cinder Drake. Ash had never beaten anything remotely close to that level. Ethan remembered how badly an epic Thunderwolf once outclassed Phase 1 Ash. Now, they faced another massive gap, this time with far greater stakes attached. Success could clear the pursuit and force Valoria to recognize Ethan publicly. Failure might leave the Iron Crest Academy room to restore its claim over Ash afterward. One legendary opponent would be dangerous enough without imagining threats outside the arena. Ash needed recovery, food, and confidence before anything else could matter. Ethan spent the final rest period checking every old injury across his body. The Cinder Drake had accumulated scars from Mistfall Crater, Pursuit, and tournament rounds. Stopping now might preserve health while failing to secure the protection they needed. The choice belonged to both of them because Ash would carry most physical risk. Ash remained alert whenever tournament noise drifted toward their resting area outside. When Ethan moved toward the arena entrance, Ash rose and followed voluntarily. That did not remove Ethan's responsibility, but it told him Ash was willing. They entered the final together with no promise another evolution would save them. Ethan's plan began with survival, observation, and protecting Ash from unnecessary exchanges. The arena erupted when the legendary tier beast stepped onto the opposite side. Ash spread his wings, and for the first time the Cinder Drake looked small. The opening signal sounded. Ethan moved first, only to measure the gap. The answer came immediately. Too fast. One sweeping strike clipped Ash's armored side and hurled him across the arena. Stoneback protection held, but a crack opened along the outer plating. Ash released smoke to steal the uncertainty that worked in earlier rounds. The legendary beast simply waited outside the cloud, then pressure punched through from an angle Ethan had not covered. The strike caught one wing and sent Ash tumbling hard. Ash crashed. He did not move. Ethan nearly ended the match on the spot. Then Ash forced himself upright before the signal left Ethan's hand. One wing hung badly, and his breathing had turned rough. At that point, the trophy stopped mattering. Ethan signaled withdrawal. The legendary beast pressed before they could reset. Ash blocked with his stronger side, and somehow stayed upright. Flight was damaged. Smoke was being read. Armor was cracking. Every tool Ethan trusted was failing at once. Ash looked back at him through the noise. Ethan remembered the pursuit, when Ash had turned back without being ordered. He refused to turn that loyalty into permission for self-destruction. Then another hit landed against the damaged armor. Something pulls beneath the crack. The pulse returned when Ash released smoke under pressure. Another response traveled through the injured wing. Not healing. Coordination. Stone durability, electrical tolerance, and pursuit-honed movement began firing together. Ethan remembered the question Alden could never answer after Ashen Vault. What if deeper Ashborn evolution required every adaptation to integrate? The final was testing that theory in the cruelest possible way. Ethan signaled retreat again. Ash moved back 2 steps, then planted his feet. He was conscious, responsive, and still choosing to continue. Ethan checked his breathing and focus before making the hardest call yet. One more exchange. Nothing beyond that. If Ash started to fail, The legendary beast charged, expecting another desperate escape. Ethan called for smoke early. Ash filled the space, but stayed grounded inside it. The opponent committed into the cloud's edge. Ash took the hit on damaged armor and slid backward. He did not fall. Every accumulated response inside his body fired at once. Ash-gray scales darkened, while copper light threaded through the old cracks. Ash lifted in a tightening spiral as the injured wing opened wider. The crowd disappeared from Ethan's awareness. This was not another borrowed trait. Ash's body was reorganizing everything he had already survived. Stone protection sank into the draconic frame as the wings broadened around it. Copper burned through ash-gray scales without erasing the scars beneath them. Even the legendary beast hesitated. Then the status panel stabilized. Ashborn Phase 3. Sovereign Cinder. Epic tier. Not legendary. But for the first time, the power gap looked beatable. Ethan gave one short signal. Ash moved, and the difference was immediate. The integrated armor moved with him instead of fighting every turn. Another legendary strike landed, but Ash stayed on his feet. He tested the damaged wing with one short ascent. The evolution had strengthened him without erasing the price already paid. Ethan changed tactics. Instead of pretending Ash had become untouchable, smoke covered the ground while Sovereign Cinder crossed above it. The legendary beast tracked the obvious aerial threat. Ash feinted downward, canceled the landing, and crossed over its shoulder. For the first time, legendary power reacted to Ethan instead of dictating the fight. Ethan saw the wing trembling and knew they had very little time. He brought Ash down before the injury could fail completely. The opponent waited outside the smoke, expecting another aerial escape. Ethan used that expectation against it. Ash burst from the smoke low to the ground. His integrated armor turned the charge into a brutal body check. The legendary beast staggered for the first time. It answered with overwhelming force and reopened damage across Ash's scales. A long exchange still favored the healthier beast. They needed one clean sequence. The opponent had already learned to guard against smoke and aerial feints. So Ethan gave it the same pattern again. Smoke, lift, delayed descent. The legendary beast shifted upward to punish the expected attack. Ethan changed the signal halfway through. Ash folded his wings and dropped straight through his own smoke. He hit the ground running while the opponent's counter was still committed upward. Their collision shook the arena. Both beasts separated, badly hurt. The legendary opponent struggled to recover its balance. Ethan saw the window. No speech was needed. Sovereign Cinder surged forward one final time. A wing-assisted burst carried him past the strongest line of resistance. His final strike landed from the angle Ethan had created. The legendary beast tried to stand. Its legs gave way. Silence hit before the roar did. Tournament officials checked the fallen beast and ended the match. Ethan and Ash had won the Valoria Open final. Only then did the arena explode around them. Ethan looked at Ash before he looked at the scoreboard. Sovereign Cinder was still standing, but every breath showed the cost of getting there. Ethan pressed one hand against the familiar ash-gray scales until Ash steadied himself. Only then did he look up and understand what the victory had changed. The discarded egg had defeated a legendary tier opponent on Valoria's largest open stage. Thousands had watched Ash follow Ethan's signals through every round. They had seen control, trust, adaptation, and a stable Phase 3 form. Ironcrest could no longer describe Ash as unknown property that Ethan could not manage. The Academy tried to delay any immediate ruling while tournament officials reviewed the final. This time, delay worked against Ironcrest instead of Ethan. Too many spectators had seen the same evidence with their own eyes. The earlier whispers around bracket manipulation also drew scrutiny toward the final's backers. Ethan did not chase that investigation himself. He spent those hours beside Ash while healers checked the damaged wing and cracked armor. For once, the political fight happened somewhere else while he protected his companion. Professor Alden stayed nearby and refused to let officials separate them during recovery. The next decision came without ceremony. Ironcrest withdrew the pursuit order. Ethan Vale was officially recognized as Ash's rightful tamer. The Ironcrest watchers outside Professor Alden's home disappeared that same day. The words landed more quietly than he expected. No sudden triumph rushed through him. Mostly, Ethan felt tired. Then relief followed. He could travel without planning escape routes around every checkpoint. Professor Alden no longer needed to hide a wanted tamer outside town. Most importantly, nobody could use Ironcrest's old excuse to take Ash away. That freedom mattered more than any apology Ethan might never receive. Only after Ash stabilized did Alden study the new form carefully. Sovereign Cinder stood roughly the size of a horse beside Ethan. Copper highlights ran through ash-gray scales hardened by years of adaptation. The stronger wings folded over a body still carrying fresh tournament scars. Phase 3 looked powerful, but the injuries made its price impossible to romanticize. Ash had survived every stage. Now, at last, survival had bought them the right to stop running. Days later, Ethan returned with Ash to Professor Alden's modest home. No crowd followed them onto the roof, where the evening had become quiet. There were no tournament lights, officials, or status panels demanding another reaction. Ethan climbed onto the roof and sat where the night air felt cooler. Ash followed more carefully now, because his larger body required far more space. The roof complained softly beneath weight that once fit easily on Ethan's arm. That contrast made Ethan smile before he even understood why completely. Ash settled beside him, wings folding until the broad frame became still. Then the massive beast lowered his head toward Ethan with familiar, casual trust. His cheek rested against Ethan's shoulder just like it had when smaller. Ethan almost laughed because the gesture had become physically ridiculous at this size. Instead, he leaned slightly into Ash and let the silence stay comfortable. He still remembered the gray shell tossed from a disposal container afterward. Back then, that shell looked like proof. The world considered him an afterthought. Now, the beast resting beside him made that memory impossible to interpret. Simply, the egg had not hidden an instant legendary champion waiting for discovery. Ash had hatched fragile, unregistered, and genuinely difficult to raise safely. What made the journey remarkable was not pretending those weak beginnings were fake. It was how much those beginnings changed through care, pressure, and adaptation. The first smoke cloud had felt miraculous because it simply helped them escape. Later, Stoneback armor turned survival into something they could approach more deliberately. The Cinder Drake's first awkward flight opened an entirely new battlefield above the ground. Iron Crest's pursuit proved Ash's loyalty when he turned back without being commanded. He smiled because neither of them had believed they could reach this place. Ethan rested one hand against the warm copper-gray scales near his shoulder. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, while Ash remained heavy against his shoulder. No altar glowed, no crowd cheered, and no system announced another evolution. For once, there was no next battle demanding immediate preparation from them. There was only the quiet. After surviving everything this journey had required, Ethan remembered the dull gray shell one final time and smiled. The egg nobody wanted had become the companion nobody could take away.